Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the Equipping ELLs podcast. Today, I'm joined by two incredible guests who bring a powerful combination of experience, compassion, and practical wisdom to the conversation around school culture and student behavior. Marg Thorsborne is a pioneer in the field of restorative practices. With a background as a high school teacher and counselor, she spent decades leading global efforts to implement restorative approaches that lead to real and lasting culture change in schools and workplaces. Joe Brummer is a trauma survivor turned international peace builder and consultant. His work centers on creating trauma-informed, human-centered environments in schools and justice systems. His deep knowledge of restorative justice, neuroscience, and mediation makes him a leading voice in transforming education through empathy and connection. Together, they've co-authored the book, Becoming a Trauma-Informed Restorative Educator, Practical Skills to Change Culture and Behavior. This is a powerful guide for educators who want to move beyond buzzwords and build classrooms grounded in safety, connection, and belonging. This episode is part of our special series on what teachers should prioritize now at the end of the school year, because we want to give you simple but impactful shifts to focus on now at the end of the year so that you can set the stage for a more successful, sustainable start next fall. So welcome to the show, Marg and Joe. It is an absolute honor to have you both here.
And it's lovely to be with you all.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. And this has been a process to try to find the same time zone. We're all over the place, but this is a conversation that we have wanted to make happen. And so I'm glad we can meet tonight and talk about this. So let's dive right in, because I have a lot of questions I want to ask you both. I want to bring your wisdom to the light and really help educators as they reflect on this last school year and look into the next school year of how best they can prepare. So for our listeners who might be new to this topic, how do you define trauma-informed education, and how does it intersect with restorative practices?
Joe, you go first with the trauma piece.
So I think there's a misunderstanding out there in the world about restorative practices and restorative justice, that it is inherently trauma-informed. And the reality is that's not true. And so we need, in order to balance restorative justice principles, we need to come at this with the lens of trauma-informed. And what that really means is unlearning behaviorism, that all behavior is choice, that this kid is either seeking pleasure or avoiding pain, when that's just not how the human brain and our nervous systems work. And so behaviorism and compliance-based discipline systems in schools have a theory of why behavior happens. And that theory doesn't stand up to our current neuroscience about how we know the brain works, how the nervous system protects us. And for kids who've been through trauma, their nervous systems are wired to survive rather than to relate. And so they may not care that they don't care about respect. They care about survival. They don't care about learning math. They care about survival. And unfortunately, that means some of their behaviors prioritize self-preservation over learning. And that can look like bad behavior. That can look like defiance. That can look like disrespect. But in reality, it's survival. And when you punish a kid, it's like punishing them for having a nervous system. That doesn't make a whole bunch of sense.
Yeah.
And so I'll let Marg sort of add the restorative justice piece to that, because that seems to be how we balance each other.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And you're absolutely right about the neuroscience. But in the early days of my restorative work, we were looking for processes that would not make things worse for a kid who was being bullied. Because what the research at the time was telling us very clearly, that if you punished a kid who was causing harm to another kid, particularly in the sort of bullying space, life would be infinitely worse for the kid who reported it. So the early experiments were really around how do we hold a young person accountable for what they've done without punishing them. Well, in the traditional sense of punishment.
Yeah.
And so as time progressed, we were able to see that this kind of approach to bullying and, serious issues that happened in schools was very much applicable to everything, from academic issues in classrooms to the kind of situations where maybe a whole class might become dysfunctional for a whole host of the usual reasons. But more recently, and thanks to the work of the neuroscientists, we've been able to help schools understand the why it's important to take another approach. And I absolutely, am aligned with Joe about behaviorism because it's only a theory, I mean, we operate on theories, but you cannot punish a skill in a kid's repertoire if they don't already have the skill. I mean, punishment doesn't heal. Punishment doesn't teach a kid how to be compassionate or empathic. So there is not enough of any of that in this world. And for the kids who have experienced extraordinary horrors in their childhoods, or not even, huge horrors, but ongoing chaos in their in their lives, their capacity to concentrate in a classroom is absolutely minimal. So this is just a perfect marriage of combining, the knowledge we understand about trauma and how kids simply have to survive, and those survival skills might not apply in the classroom, but the kid's brain doesn't know that. It's just a perfect. Joe and I use the word symbiosis. I actually think it's marriage. It's a perfect marriage of two complementary, integrated approaches, which make perfect sense from both ends of that spectrum.
Absolutely. And I love starting here because I think there is a lot of unpacking of those lenses as, that teachers are seeing things through still, even when there's new practices, when they're maybe looking through an outdated lens, when we have so much more information on neuroscience, on what's actually going on with these students. And we have so much that we can do in the classroom. I think so many of our students are in the classroom more than anywhere else. And so, what an incredible opportunity as teachers to get to be that person that's their advocate, that safe place that can really take what you all are teaching and apply that, make that the priority. I think that's why this series on prioritizing, this is one of those absolute foundational places that all educators need to begin as we enter this next school year. Because, like I was sharing before we started, many of the listeners are working with students, newcomers entering from war-torn countries, from just really difficult situations as they've, for their arrival into the classroom. But even beyond that, all students, the world is in a very crazy place right now, whatever country you're in, right? There's just so much that's going on. There's things that kids are experiencing that they're entering our classrooms. And Joe, I loved your explanation that they're not ready for math when they're just looking at survival. That is their focus, is survival, because of what they've come through. So this is just such an important conversation. I can't thank you both enough for being here. Now, in your book, you emphasize the importance of adult self-regulation as a key part of trauma-informed classrooms. So I think this is important to start here because I would love for you to talk about why it's essential for educators to do their own internal work first.
Many of our kids are coming into school with baggage. And what we tend to forget is so are the educators and the adults around them. And in our current systems, like our current the current vibe of the universe right now, especially, I mean, I'm in the US, so like it's tense here right now, like probably the most tense it's been since, I don't know when, like definitely the most since I've been alive, and I'm 55. You know, I lived through the tear down of the Berlin Wall. I lived through the Cold War, and it still feels more tense here. But I realize it's raising my nervous system. Now think about all the educators that are teaching children. Their nervous systems are up. They're amped. They're nervous. It's uncomfortable. And either they love what's going on, or they're really worried about what's going on. But either way, their nervous systems are reacting. Unfortunately, nervous systems are contagious. And so, what nervousness the adults are experiencing transfers to the kids. And the only way that kids have to express that, since they can't really access language when they're upset, what do kids do to tell you they're not okay? They use behavior. And so we may think of their behavior right now in any particular country as disrespectful, defiant, et cetera, et cetera. But is it that? Or is it they're just reacting that the very people who should be giving them cues of safety for their nervous system are the same people that are giving them cues of non-safety, of if that's even a word, of insecurity, of fear, of unsettled. And so what we know about the human brain, and it makes sense because we're herd creatures, that the state of our nervous system is contagious. And we all know that because we've all been in that staff meeting where somebody walked in and sucked the air out of the room. We've also been in those meetings where somebody left and everybody took a breath, right? We know that nervous systems are contagious and that we affect each other. And that gets more technical than anybody could possibly imagine. But for educators, doing your work means befriending your nervous system. Whenever I go to a school and I find a classroom where there are like zero behavior problems and the teacher's like super chill and it's just the perfect classroom, what I tend to find is that the teacher in front of the classroom is really, their nervous system's regulated. They've slept. They ate this morning. They did a workout yesterday. They listened to a cool music before they came into class. They prepped their nervous system to be in class and share that nervous system with their kids. I love that Lori DeSottle's quote where she says, "Is my nervous system big enough to hold both of us?" And that's what this self-work, like if we're not working on ourselves, taking care of our wellness, getting some sleep, making sure we've got nutrition, not just food in your system, but actually nutrition. Serotonin doesn't come out of nowhere. You got to give yourself amino acids. You got to eat the right foods, right? So when we take care of ourselves, we befriend our nervous systems. What we're doing is balancing out our body's budget. And it's not a budget of money. It's a budget of serotonin, glucose, sugar, saline, all the right chemicals, oxytocin. And when we're balanced out, we're regulated. We're good. We can handle stress. But when the stress comes at us and we're all discombobulated, that's also contagious to our students. You want to calm down your students, you got to be calm. You want to take on that student that wants to fight you, then you got to be calm. And in order for that to happen, educators need to do their own work. The importance of educators, and I hate the word self-care. I try not to use it, but it's not self-care, it's well-being, it's wellness. Like the importance of educator wellness. We need you to take care of yourself because you love yourself and you've done your work. You've healed your own trauma so you don't bleed that trauma on your kids and your students. And that's where this matters. And there's been studies done, and if somebody really wants to find them, I can send them to you. They did a small-scale study at one point that showed that educators, in lack of anything else, will fall back to the discipline practices of their parents. That's not always a good thing. Let's face it, not all of us had great childhoods. And so is that really what we want for our students? And the answer might be no. And so you got to do your own work. And I know that sucks. I know that that's like teachers are rolling their eyes at me right now and don't tell me what to do. But I totally get that feeling of like, do I have to do this? And the answer is, I'm sorry, yes. If you really want to be that great teacher that gets Teacher of the Year award, then yes, you got to do that work on your own nervous system. And so I'll shut up now and let Marg talk.
Well, Joe, I agree with absolutely everything you say, but I would also like to add that the first round of contagious anxiety that we've witnessed, not just right now, this extraordinary space we're in, but during COVID. So the uncertainty of learning from home or going to school or going to work or working from home, and am I going to catch COVID? And what about my parents? What if my elderly father catches COVID? It was anxiety plus. And I think that even before this latest round of anxiety that has happened because of the change in administration in America, which is a global anxiety, I think, at the moment, is because things aren't predictable anymore. And I'm surprised
Yeah.
Joe hasn't even used the word predictable for the moment. But we feel a whole pile safer when we are predictable. And look, just in the space of us having to look after ourselves so that our brains can hold someone else's dysregulated brain. I've been in touch recently with a principal of a primary school in England, and his mantra for the school is, "We are an emotionally available school." And in the kind of work that he does with his own staff, he has an expectation of professional maturity and professional generosity. So this means that we have to get out of the way we were socialized. It is a rare person who has the perfect childhood. Now, my husband and I both agreed when we married that we wouldn't turn out like our mothers. And every time I get up in the morning, there she is staring at me. The discipline of pushing those scary thoughts away and living in the moment. So, I think one of our great gifts that we can give anyone at the moment is to keep hope alive, really. But I also have a neuroscience friend, actually, Joe. It's Nathan Wallace from New Zealand, who you met at that conference, who's an extraordinary fellow. But he says that when we're dealing with a child, there has to be at least one mature prefrontal cortex in the conversation. But actually, how that also translates is there has to be one settled, regulated brain in the conversation. And it's too tough to expect kids, when they're upset, to have the goods to calm themselves down, unless, there's been plenty of mentoring and teaching in all of that. So, from the restorative perspective, when we're having those conversations with kids, which actually are the consequence, so one of the myths about restorative is, well, there aren't. Where's the consequence? Because people who are steeped in behaviorism can only see a punitive consequence. Yeah. And so they're only happy if they can see a head on a spike out the front of the school, guts for garters. And unless you do the training, or unless you've actually participated in one of these restorative processes, you won't feel what it feels like. It's impossible to feel it unless you've done it. Don't you think, Joe?
Oh, I completely agree.
Yeah. And so what we're looking for is that kind of moment in a restorative conversation, or a slightly more formal process, or even a really serious and formal process, because something really bad has happened. But what we have to do in these processes is help people feel safe going in by managing their expectations. So there's still going to be a little bit anxious, but that sense of safety should increase during a well facilitated process. And then there is a moment of transformation where people start to feel differently about each other and they feel different about themselves. And so that moment for me is where empathy for the other kind of, and it's not about, well, okay, now you've said you're sorry, so off you. No, what we have to do now is try and figure out what's going to need to happen to repair the rupture that has occurred. And we are herd animals and we are wired to live a good, thriving connection with each other. And we have all of the sort of hardware and software in our brains to notice when there are ruptures. But unless you're raised in a family or a culture or a school that is conflict competent, people don't naturally know what to do. And so it's beyond me where people think that punishment can teach the skill that's missing. It's just nuts.
Yeah. I don't think there's a lot of studies that show the benefit to that or the increased behavior, right, of the outcome that we are looking for. So hopefully this conversation sparks that. But I just, from what you both have shared, I just feel like as educators, what a gift it is that if we do the work and the work is not enjoyable, but that's why we're putting it in this time. So teachers, you have the summer, this is the perfect time to do the work. And what a gift to come into the classroom. And, as things in this world, the world's always going to be in a chaotic situation, whether it's COVID or now, it comes and goes. So we can't hope that things are all going to be peaceful in the world, in my opinion. But what we can do is we can look at those students who are in front of us in the classroom, and we can come prepared at the place that we can be, where we can take on what they're going through and help to create future generations that aren't going to continue to walk in these ways and walk in this dysregulation. They're going to learn, because if we do the work, we're ready to take that on. And I think that that's really, what a gift as an educator to get that opportunity to change the future, to change generations, because we're showing up ready. So for those who are listening, you have this summer. This is the perfect time to get the book, and we're going to share about that in a minute. But, so let's talk a little about trauma, because I know that's where we kind of see that I think this is becoming more common, more popular conversations in the school. Maybe back, 10 years ago, it wasn't, but now I think these are conversations happening. But like I said at the beginning, moving it from just that buzzword, like, let's talk about more of the trauma. And one idea that kind of stands out in the book is that trauma isn't just about what happens to a person, but also how those experiences affect their sense of safety. So, Jo, you were kind of hitting on that. How can educators start to recognize the invisible signs of trauma in students? Because I think sometimes teachers know situations that are going on, and sometimes they don't have any idea of what these students are going through and the trauma that it's creating in them.
Yeah, sometimes trauma isn't what happens to you, it's what didn't happen to you that should have. So neglect, attachment, like, some children just don't get the attachment from their parents that they needed to become really great, to move on with their lives successfully. And so, again, the way that you get trauma and the way that you see trauma is to start with yourself. So what Marg and I talked about in the book, and it was actually, I think it was some of the first initial frameworks that we came up with. And I don't remember some parts of the book I can remember who came up with it and who didn't, and whether it was me or Marg, but one of us, and I don't remember who, came up with this idea that this is a 3-part journey. That the first part of this journey is working on yourself and recognizing your own trauma, recognizing your own nervous system, befriending your own nervous system. And when you do that, you then get to recognize, it's basic empathy. You get to recognize in others hey, that looks like maybe. And so I think when you do the work, then you get to see those invisible signs of trauma. And, for those kids that, for kids who've been, I'll give you a really good example. Kids who've been exposed to neglect have a tendency to be extremely independent. They may even look bossy, right? Or because they're used to running their own lives at 6, 7 years old. They're not used to being told what to do. And so all of a sudden you tell them what to do and they're like, I don't think so. Right? That's not defiance. That's a child who's managed their whole life on their own so far. And maybe as even parenting their younger siblings at 8 years old. They're taking care of their 4-year-old brother. And so all of a sudden this teacher comes along and they're like, hey, I'm going to tell you what to do. And they're like, no, you're not. Nobody tells me what to do. They're not used. This is out of their realm. Is that defiance? Or is that, again, hidden signs of trauma in our students? And that's the heart. So those three realms of this journey, there's three parts of this journey. There's a personal journey. There's a professional journey, and then there's a social justice journey. We can't ignore what's going on around us in our systems. And so part of that first part, that self journey, is to start recognizing trauma, learning about trauma, doing the workshops, reading the books, listening to the podcasts, as I sit here on a podcast. The whole idea of that personal journey is to do your work. And I know we ask so much of educators and now you want me to heal kids' trauma. We're not asking their trauma.
No.
We're asking you to recognize and respond, to refer, recognize, respond, refer, right? Very simple.
Yeah.
And by doing that, what we really can do for kids is set up systems where, one, they can heal. We're asking you to do it? No, but we're asking you to set up an environment where it's possible and where they're not getting re-traumatized. That's the important, where they're not just constantly struggling to be in that survival mode. They can be in a learning mode, and it's a matter of doing the work. So the way that educators start to see the invisible signs of trauma is to start doing your work about learning about trauma. You want to recognize trauma, well, then learn about it. Nobody learned about how to cook until they bought a bunch of cooking books. Nobody learned about how the intricacies of cinema till they started learning about how movies are made. Nobody learns about the intricacies of language until they learned a few languages, right? We have to do our homework. Go read the books, go read the podcasts, go to the conferences, come to a training with Mark and I. We would love to have you. But a lot of it is just you have to do your work.
Yes. And Joe, it's interesting that we're talking about this very thing because I've spent 4 days with 2 groups of people here in this school in South Korea. And while I know, I made it clear to them that 2 days it is just kind of scratching the surface. Oh my God, you've got to do the reading. And I was very pleased to see, Joe, and I think I commented to you that their reading material that the school provided for them was a copy of that book each, which was...
She sent me pictures.
I love that.
The people who came up to me and said, oh my God, this is going to change the way I think about parenting, because I was parented in a certain way and I want to do something differently. I want to be better at it. And, I think in addition to the kind of self-education that we need to do, there's also a space or an attitude towards kids' strange, non-compliant behaviour is to be curious rather than make a judgment straight up that this kid is non-compliant and they need to feel some pain. But, there's a mantra that I use: curious, not furious. Be prepared to explore, not explode, and seek to understand. And these days, when I'm talking about this kind of how do we approach it, what sort of mindset well, certainly I have to be regulated to be curious, not furious, for starters, might need kind of take a deep breath and count to 10 or whatever, and that is to be curious, not curious, and say, hey, can we have a bit of a chat about this? Because I think we both need to make sense of what's happening at the moment. I'm very, very interested in what's going on for you. So what I notice is X, Y, what is happening? And the other thing I want to say too about not just the adults educating themselves about their own brains, we have to teach kids about their own brains. And I think that's what Laurie does so beautifully, Joe, is that she's, has written so many resources. I think her website's called revelationsineducation.com, and resources in here for helping kids understand when they're dysregulated and what they need to figure out, with help from a regulated adult, obviously, is how to calm themselves down. Now, Joe talked before about having to have the resources. Maybe there is a space in a room somewhere which is calm with perfect lighting and lovely things to distract yourself or soothe yourself with. But in the old days, it's still happening, which doesn't make it old, it just makes it old-fashioned, that some kids are given a little card that they can flash, when they're being overwhelmed. But not all their teachers agree with that little flash card either. They think you're just using an excuse to get out of math, So there has to be this common knowledge, a shared understanding across the school community, at least of the adults, and then some sorts of strategies to introduce the idea that learning about your brain and learning about your self-regulation is every bit as important as math. That it's not a little kind of hook on the side and we'll do it if we feel like it, but simply part of the curriculum.
And I'll just throw in there for giggles, right? I'm 55 years old. I have rarely in my life ever had a need for algebra. But I've had a mad ass need to regulate my nervous system. I've had a mad crazy need to be able to regulate my emotions. School was really intense about me learning algebra that I've never needed. But they never came back and told me like how important it was to take care of my mental health, or how important it would be to regulate my emotions, or to just model calmness. Like none of that was a conversation. Even the skills of conflict resolution. We teach kids things they don't need versus things they do. And I don't want to criticize teachers. I don't want to, because it's not them. They're handed anymore in almost most countries, because we've all started moving to this realm where we're stuffing these curriculums in the hands of teachers. We're taking away teacher autonomy. So they're not even allowed to teach the way they've been trained to teach. They have to follow these curriculums that are sometimes crap. And it's like they're taught a new curriculum every year. And they're like, what was wrong with the last one? But this is not a curriculum. Trauma-informed and restorative practice is not a curriculum. It's a lens. This is how we see the world. This is when you see that misbehaving kid. I always try to stress for people, if you took the diagnostic criteria for ADHD and the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and put them side by side, PTSD and ADHD look really, really similar. So does that kid need Adderall, or does that kid need safe space to be themselves? And if you want them to learn algebra, you're going to have to address both of those things. And I don't think that's where I think we're so drowning in ABA and behaviorism, and kids are choosing to misbehave. We're forgetting that this is literally trashing their brain. For those of you that don't see this video, I just held up my cell phone, which is trashing my brain. So,
we're adults. It's still.
Children don't act independently the way we think they do. They act in environments that we create. So the adults create the environment, we create the conditions and circumstances, we created the expectations, but who do we punish when they can't follow them? Let's think through this just for a second. That doesn't make a damn bit of sense.
with especially, I mean, with all students, safety, number one for any other learning that's going to happen. We know that, but even more, I think, with our language learners, because learning another language, there's so much vulnerability. There's so much fear. There's so much anxiety. But I know a lot of teachers I speak with, they haven't had the experiences like their students. And that's not an excuse though to just say, well, I don't understand them. I think this is so key of what you're sharing is do the work to go and learn about trauma, learn about it. Because when you start, even this conversation has already, shifted a chip in me of, I want to go deeper on this for my own children, for my own, just the impact I have in education. I want to learn more about this. And through that empathy grows, right? Because we can't just create empathy out of nothing. When we learn, though, and start to see the signs, start to have understanding, start to hear the stories. That's what I always say. Go back to ask their stories, listen to them. And that's where we can approach them with that empathy lens and not, oh, they're disruptive. Oh, this is, disrupting everything in my class. Let's stop. Let's take a breath. Let's really approach our students and assume the best from them and look at ourselves, the opportunity we have to make a difference in their lives.
This really brings a story to mind about a connection a colleague and I have with a school in the north of the state I live in, North Queensland, and it's an Indigenous boarding school for girls and also some day students. Now, those kids come to that boarding school from all over, and all over involves lots and lots of different languages. And so if a new girl arrives at the school and she's not, she's ESL, English as a second language, or maybe even a third or a fourth language, then what's been happening in this school, and this is why the lens is so important, is that there is so much violence there because when a girl is trying to understand the English that's coming out of another girl's mouth, they look at their faces really carefully. They watch their mouths very carefully to see what sense they can make of these words. But that other girl says, "You're looking at me. You're giving me the death stare." And so what will happen is that eventually there will be a fight. So my last piece of advice, in the last conversation we had, and all of this is by Zoom at the moment, was that I don't think your school is even ready for restorative, the introduction of restorative. What you need is a whole school approach, regulation. Those kids need to know how to not read threat into someone who's looking at them. So where can those kids learn if they're frightened of each other in a classroom? And what about that poor kid who's just arrived? Instead of getting a radical welcome, what she get? A fight. She's beaten up because she's looking too hard at someone else's face. It's nuts. So, but when your policies and practices are based on behaviorism, then violence is naughty, very naughty, and you're going to get suspended. Yeah, there's not even room for restorative up there yet. I'm absolutely convinced it needs to be a neuroscience trauma-informed approach first, and that will take ages and ages.
That story Marg just told about two young people trying to read each other's facial expressions is another example of how we, the adults, set the culture environment. We're the thermostat, not the thermometer. We set the temperature of the room. If we create a space where that sort of stuff has room, like, hey, let's talk about facial expressions. Hey, let's circle up and talk about how we connect with each other. If you set up the right environment, these practices are not about having an alternative to discipline. They're about preventing the problems that require that discipline. Right. And so when we think in terms of, two young women misreading each other, we as the adults have the opportunity to create an environment where that situation won't turn out poorly. Or we, the adults, are also in charge of setting up the conditions, circumstances, and expectations that could turn that into an absolute disaster where somebody's going to be hurt. We're the ones in charge. They're just children. It's our job to keep them safe. It's our job to create the circumstances, conditions, and environments that will have the outcomes we need. Compliance, this has been shown every time. Compliance-based systems in schools up seclusion and restraint. They up suspensions and exclusions and expulsions. Trauma-informed approaches don't do that, and so they reduce those things. I don't know how many times we need to do the research to show you the research. That's what happens. Apparently, like, even the people that look at the research want to well, that's not real. They didn't account for this. No one wants to believe the research. But here it is. Here it is. You know?
And Joe, one of the things that we mentioned in the book too was the gap between the evidence and the take-up of practice. And that's called the
Absolutely.
evidence practice gap. And I think in education it's about 20 years, although the research was originally done in hospitals around new, sorts of drugs or new kinds of treatment, and the average was 17. But I remember Nathan Wallace talking years and years ago about the 20-year gap between the old thinking and the new. So in terms of our own brains, we need to do a bit of rewiring. And, people don't like to give up on their old theories, do they?
They fight.
It makes life uncertain for a while if you give up on your own theories.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just some of the smallest things that are going to make a difference. So over these 2 days, because I was working with classroom teachers, we were just talking about some really basic stuff around connect before content. Make sure you're greeting kids as if you're pleased to see them. The radical welcome. Get their name right. There's this extraordinary number of kids during the course of a school day whose name is never spoken by an adult. That's not right. So connect before content. Make sure, that that they know enough about their own brains that they can communicate to you that they are perhaps not having their best day. So there's some sort of question that can be asked as kids come in the door about, well, how are you today? Or something even simpler than that. But there's an indicator that maybe I'm not 100% broadband ready for learning. Bruce Perry has given us just the best 3R rule, accessing the cortex for learning, which is make sure the kid's regulated, make sure that the connection between you and that kid is one where he or she feels safe and that they matter to you. That's the relational piece. And then if you're really lucky, you might be able to access their broadband and teach the lesson or have the restorative conversation that you might need to have. But it's so important, and I don't think Joe and I can emphasize it enough, that the adult has to be regulated. And it doesn't mean that they're sort of super chilled out and nothing worries, but you need to be able to read the play, and you need to, when a class needs to be energized, and you need to know when it needs to be calmed down, and that there are, and what Bruce Perry says, of course, is that not one kind of strategy works for every kid, so you have to be flexible about that. So some kids would like to draw, others would like, read quietly, others might do well with yoga. There's particular music's good. I wouldn't recommend death metal for calming kids down, but there is a piece of music that's created particularly, like it was part of the deal, from this band called Marconi Union. and they wrote a piece called Weightless, and you can access it online, and it's often part of relaxation apps. But look, even just me talking about the music helps me remember that when I watch that or listen to that music.
But if you type in bilateral music, you'll find this music. And what it does is it utilizes both sides of the brain. And so what it's doing is helping you cross that meridian line of the two hemispheres of the brain to calm them by integrating them. And so the whole goal of this is an integrated, flexible nervous system, right? And I know that sounds like a whole lot of neuroscience mumbo jumbo. Integrated what? What are you integrating? And basically what you're integrating is the parts of the brain, the two hemispheres, where there's various lobes and systems. But we need our brain to work together. You know, the limbic system needs to work with the cortex, which needs to work with the brainstem. And all of this happens naturally to some degree. Trauma gets in the way. And so when we start to realize that the systems don't work so smoothly and integratedly and flexibly, it means that what you find in, I don't want to say a healthy brain, but a brain unaffected by trauma that was allowed to grow up in a really good attachment and a really good system has a flexible nervous system and a flexible brain, where systems are working together really easily. But sometimes traumatized brains, like, they have trouble making the different systems work together because certain systems have been wired or developed or overdeveloped. And so what we see in kids who've been through a lot of traumatic experiences or have a high ACE score, what you see in those kids is an exaggerated amygdala, an underdeveloped hippocampus. You might actually see the opposite. You might see that the lower parts of their brain are more developed than the upper parts of their brain. And it comes down to the fact that our brains are use dependent. What grows is what's used. The brain prunes away anything you don't use. And so if you're constantly experiencing, survival mode and in heightened nervous system, sense of unsafety, our brains are predictive. And so that now predicts forward. Those are the parts of the brain that can grow, which means the parts of the brain involved in reasoning, relationship, reality checking, those parts don't grow because they don't get used. What you use is what you grow. Well, if you constantly put a kid into a war state, natural disasters, like some of our kids coming from other countries to come to places to do English language learning are actually coming from places where their brains have been wired over and over and over again to survive. Well, that doesn't really include, like, I don't know, science projects about skin and algebra problems and, long division. Like, long division, will I eat today? The brain's fighting those things. And so, I think what we're trying to stress to teachers is, look, we're not asking you to heal these kids. We're asking you to set up the circumstances, conditions, and environments where they can feel safe enough to learn. Are you going to solve all their problems? Not likely. Will you make it so they can figure out algebra? Sure, that's possible. Even despite their past, they can learn. And by the way, I have a degree, I've written 2 books, and I've been through horrific amounts of trauma. We can create circumstances and conditions where people can thrive despite what they've been through. And I'm walking, living proof of that. And so all of our kids right now can be that living proof if we set up the circumstances, the conditions, and the environments, and we make sure that we, the adults, are regulated. And I know that I stress that like a broken record, but it's because it's really, really, really important.
Oh, it's a good broken record, Joe. The other thing, when I think about my childhood, versus your childhood, Joe, I am extraordinarily grateful that the universe plonked me down in the family that I did grow up in, but it wasn't without tragedy, So Joe's story is about trauma. Mine's been about tragedy, but I think along the way, both of us have found others who have buffered us through these experiences, and we can be the buffer for those kids, can't we? So, I mean, and just the gift of writing the book with Joe, even though it was highly stressful, and anxiety provoking because deadlines loomed and they passed and they loomed and they passed again, but we got it over the line eventually. But I learnt more about myself in those 18 months and since, because now I am so excited to continue to explore, and the best place I can teach anyone about their brain is from understanding my own brain. It's been just the most interesting journey, and I am so grateful. I'm grateful Joe's in my life, along with our publisher.
You two are both so inspirational and just such a pleasure to have on the show today. We're running out of time. I feel like we just barely hit the surface on all these things, and I could talk to you all forever about these topics and just hear more of your stories and more about what you've written about. But hopefully those who are listening, I know that they're going to also want to know more. And so why don't you share more about where they can find your book, and you both individually where they can, attend different trainings or things that you have to offer.
So our book is available at any retailer. You can always have them order it if they don't have it in stock, but it's also available on Amazon and your basic, it's also available from Jessica Kingsley Publishers right on their website. They could come train with us in a couple of different places. So Marg and I are going to be in Portland, Oregon together in June, the end of June,
Yes, yes.
with the National Center for Restorative Justice. And then we're also going to be together. Marg won't be with us physically, but she will definitely be with us virtually. But then other people who are involved in the book. And so our book had a couple of guest authors, Jessica Harris, who wrote about an alternative to suspension called CLIMB, which is an acronym that stands for Children Learning Independently to Manage Behavior. And then a woman named Megan Baldwin, who's a really good friend, who is an expert in something called BalaVisX. BalaVisX stands for Balanced Audio Visual Exercises. It involves racquetballs and sandbags to teach kids how to integrate their brains. And it uses patterned, rhythmic, repetitive motion to calm and build executive function. It's absolutely incredible. And Meg will be there along with a colleague of ours named Rick Kane, who's an expert on wellness and health coaching. He's got a PhD in health education, former educator, as well as a certified health coach through Duke University, and has his ACE certification in personal training. And so he's going to be with us to talk about educator wellness. And so we're going to have a week-long training in Kansas this July. And you can learn more about that by just kind of contacting me at joe@joebrummer.com, and I'll be happy to, or just following me on my Facebook page, which is just at Joe Brummer. Please feel free to find me, and we'll definitely hook you up. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, X, Blue Sky.
Okay.
In
And
one of
we'll
those
leave
things,
these
I have an
things in the
account.
show notes, so people will find you. We'll make sure of it.
I'm on all of them.
Yeah, so, I work all over, everywhere. So happily in Australia, a lot of work in New Zealand, Southeast Asia, and I have an office in London, which sounds very posh, but actually it's a laptop in someone's lounge room. And yeah, look, I'm just keen for an adventure. So very much looking forward to the work in the northwest of the United States, as well as Portland. I'll also be in Seattle, training managers, senior and middle managers around restorative approaches in workplaces as well. So I love that work. It is fabulous. Yeah.
Those sound like incredible opportunities. We'll make sure to link all those things in the show notes and the link right to your book, so educators can start there with maybe a good summer reading. But again, I just want to thank you both so much for joining me today and for the work that you're doing in both education and the workplace, and just helping make healthier humans to help make healthier students, right? So this is really incredible. Thank you both so much. And I hope we continue this conversation later on.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Beth.
thanks for having us.
Yeah, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate that.
Well, if we all do our little part, we make this world a better place. So, all right. Well, thanks so much. And, maybe another book will come out and we'll have you back on, or we'll just continue part 2 of this, because there's so much more we could go with just this one. Thank you both.